Welcome to the WWC Advanced Group Design Standards training module focused on randomized controlled trials reporting complier average causal effects. You can access all the resources mentioned in this module through the WWC website, whatworks.ed.gov. This module describes the WWC's procedures and standards for reviewing another type of advanced group design that is less common in the education research literature, namely randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, that estimate complier average causal effects, or CACEs. After completing this module, you will be able to describe why researchers may estimate CACEs in an RCT study design. You will also be able to describe how the WWC reviews evidence from these types of advanced group designs. A key feature of RCTs is the random assignment of participants to the intervention and comparison conditions. But participants do not always comply with their assigned conditions in an RCT. For instance, some participants who are randomly assigned to the intervention group actually might not receive intervention services. And similarly, some participants who are randomly assigned to the comparison group nevertheless might receive some or all parts of the intervention. This scenario is referred to as non-compliance, when participants do not comply with their originally assigned conditions. When there is non-compliance in an RCT, researchers interested in the effects of education interventions typically will estimate either one or both of two types of intervention impacts. The first type of impact, known as the intent to treat, or ITT effect, represents the effect of being assigned to the intervention. This ITT impact represents the mean difference in outcomes between the assigned intervention group and the assigned comparison group, regardless of impact. The other type of impact that researchers might estimate in an RCT with noncompliance is the complier average causal effect, or CACE, which is the effect of receiving the intervention. The CACE represents the effect of taking up the intervention among compliers, namely, those who would take up the intervention if assigned to the intervention condition, as well as those who would not take up the intervention if assigned to the comparison condition. This is sometimes referred to as the local average treatment effect, or LATE. Let's talk about compliers. Look at the rectangular graphics in this slide. On the left, we have the intervention group, and on the right, the comparison group. The first row of individuals are our compliers. These are the units who, on the left, when assigned to the intervention, are in fact treated, and on the right, when assigned to the comparison group, are not treated. These are the units for whom researchers are calculating the intervention effect when they estimate the CACE. In the middle row, we have the always takers. You can see that always takers are treated by the intervention, t = 1, regardless of whether they are assigned to the intervention or comparison group. Always takers assigned to the comparison group are crossovers. And in the bottom row are the never takers. These units are not treated by the intervention regardless of assignment, t = 0. So the never takers assigned to the intervention group are considered no-shows. One thing that is important to note is that we are not able to distinguish compliers from always takers in the intervention group, or to distinguish compliers from never takers in the comparison group. So again, the CACE represents the average effect of taking up the intervention among compliers. The advantage of the CACE is that it seeks to estimate the effect of the intervention on those who received it. This is in contrast to an ITT impact estimate, which estimates the effect of an intervention on those who initially were assigned to conditions, regardless of intervention receipt. If compliance were perfect, meaning everyone assigned to the intervention group received it, and everyone assigned to the comparison group did not, then the CACE estimate would equal the ITT estimate. So how do researchers estimate the CACE? The CACE cannot be estimated with a subgroup analysis restricted to compliers, because researchers cannot fully distinguish compliers from other sample members. Again, among participants assigned to the intervention group, compliers cannot be distinguished from always takers because both groups take up the intervention. And among participants assigned to the comparison group, Compliers cannot be distinguished from never takers because neither group takes up the intervention. Instead, researchers typically estimate the case with an instrumental variables estimator, which uses only the variation in take-up that is induced by the random assignment process when estimating the impact of taking up the intervention. This is the same approach that is typically used for estimating treatment effects in fuzzy regression discontinuity designs, called fuzzy RDDs or FRDDs. So broadly speaking, the instrumental variable approach allows for a causal effect to be calculated by finding an exogenous variable that is associated with an outcome only through its association with intervention receipt. In this approach, researchers specify instrumental variables, which are variables that strongly influence take-up of the intervention, but are assumed to be uncorrelated with other factors that influence the outcome. In RCTs reporting cases, the instrumental variable is a binary indicator for the groups to which subjects were assigned randomly. The instrumental variable approach also requires researchers to specify an exogenous independent variable, which is one whose impact on outcomes is the impact of interest. So in RCTs reporting cases, the endogenous instrumental variable is a binary indicator for taking up the intervention. It is endogenous because its variation could be affected by participants' decisions. For instance, a particularly uninterested member of the intervention group might decide not to participate in the intervention, and the unobserved factors underlying the decision might also be correlated with outcomes. The instrumental variables estimator is typically estimated via two-stage least squares, which first estimates the effect of assignment to the intervention group on receipt of the intervention, which is called the first stage equation, and then estimates the effect of predicted receipt of the intervention on the outcome of interest, which is called the structural equation. So the first stage equation in a two-stage least squares model is one that models the endogenous independent variable as a function of the instrumental variable and possibly other covariates. So the first stage equation models the extent to which take-up of the intervention is influenced by randomly assigned group status. Assigned group status should influence take-up of the intervention because participants assigned to the intervention group are supposed to receive the intervention, and those assigned to the comparison group are not supposed to receive it. The structural equation in a two-stage least squares approach is then one that models the outcome as a function of the endogenous independent variable and possibly other contexts. The estimation of the structural model then produces an estimate of the case, or the impact of intervention take-up on outcomes among compliers. Before we move on to discussing the eligibility requirements for case estimates from RCTs, we want to discuss the similarities to the FRDD standards. Throughout the rest of the module, you will see that the eligibility requirements and review steps for case estimates from RCTs are similar to the criterion that make up the FRDD standard, with the exception that the case estimates from RCTs do have a functional form and bandwidth requirement, because cases from RCTs do not use exactly the same modeling approach as FRDDs. An important difference between the case estimates we discuss in this module and FRDDs is that the assignment process for an RCT uses randomization, while FRDDs are a form of quasi-experimental design that may also produce a case estimate. While we assess many of the same features in the review process of both designs, the difference in this assignment process means the specific elements that determine a finding's eligibility versus a finding's research rating also differ. Now let's discuss the eligibility requirements for case estimates from an RCT. To be eligible for WWC review, a case estimate from an RCT must be based on statistical methods that meet all four conditions listed here. Studies that do not meet these criteria will not be reviewed by the WWC. First, the endogenous independent variable must be a binary indicator for taking up any portion of the intervention. The WWC does not yet have standards for evaluating studies that examine the effects of a continuous measure of intervention dosage, which is why this requirement specifies that the endogenous independent variable must be binary. The second requirement is that each structural equation that the researchers estimate, regardless of the number of instruments, must have exactly one endogenous independent variable, a binary indicator for participation. So, if random assignment is used to form two assignment groups, an intervention group and a comparison group, then there will be one instrumental variable, a binary indicator that distinguishes the groups. Some studies may include multiple instruments, such as a multi-site trial, where the structural equation includes interactions between an indicator for treatment assignment and the site. This structural equation includes multiple instruments, but only one endogenous independent variable. The third requirement is that the researchers must use the same set of baseline covariates in the structural equation and first stage equation. So if baseline covariates are included in the analysis, then the structural equation and first stage equation must contain identical sets of baseline covariates. This requirement is necessary because if a baseline covariate from the first stage equation is not included in the structural equation, that covariate is effectively serving as an instrumental variable. And if a baseline covariate from the structural model is not included in the first stage equation, then the model will be under-identified. The fourth and final criterion is that the study must estimate the case using either two-stage least squares regression or a method that produces the same estimate as two-stage least squares regression. As we discussed previously, the impact of intervention take-up among compliers is estimated in two-stage least squares using a first-stage equation and a structural equation. At the second stage, or estimation of the structural equation, researchers obtain an estimate of the case. For RCTs that report cases and meet the four criteria just mentioned, the WWC uses the review process displayed here. First, reviewers will assess whether the study's instrumental variable has sufficient instrument strength. If the study's instrumental variable does not have sufficient instrument strength, then the findings will be rated does not meet WWC standards. If there is sufficient instrument strength, reviewers then will assess whether there is a clear violation of the exclusion restriction. If the exclusion restriction has been violated, then the findings will be rated does not meet WWC standards. If the exclusion restriction has not been violated, then reviewers will next assess attrition and baseline equivalence to determine the final research rating. We now will discuss each of these steps in turn. The first step in reviewing eligible study findings from RCTs that report cases is to assess whether the study's instrumental variable has sufficient instrument strength. Remember that the instrumental variable is a binary indicator or indicators for the groups to which subjects were assigned randomly. For instance, while an individual assignment RCT is likely to only have one indicator, a multi-site trial investigating variation in instrument strength might include an indicator for assignment as well as interactions between assignment and site. All of the indicators would be instruments, and the strength of the instruments together would need to be assessed. The WWC is concerned about weak instruments because weak instruments do not effectively predict the corresponding endogenous independent variable. That is, a weak instrument means that random assignment to the intervention would not predict participation in the intervention, meaning noncompliance is common. And if noncompliance is common, then estimates of the case will be biased and inefficient. In order to satisfy the WWC's requirement of sufficient instrument strength, researchers must provide evidence of the instrument strength. Researchers will report on the strength of the instrument by reporting a first-stage F statistic, in which the F statistic for the joint significance of the instrument or instruments in the first-stage equation. Researchers therefore must report a first-stage F statistic that is at least as large as the minimum required level shown in this table. So for models that only include one instrument, researchers must report a first stage F statistic that is 16.38 or larger. For models with two instruments, the first stage F statistic must be 19.93 or larger, and so on. It is important to note that if there is only one instrument, study authors may report a T statistic instead. In this case, the F statistic is equal to the square of the T statistic, meaning that a study could satisfy this criterion if it had one instrument and reported a first stage F statistic of 4. The F statistic used to satisfy this criterion should only reflect the significance of the instruments and thus should not be derived from a model that includes baseline covariates in the first stage equation. Further, if the unit of assignment in the study design differs from the unit of analysis, then the researchers must report the first stage F statistics after adjusting for clustering. If study authors do not report an associated first stage F statistic in their study, the WWC will send an author query to request that information. And if the authors do not provide the first stage F statistic after being queried, then the WWC will try to calculate it if there is only one instrumental variable and no clustering. See Appendix G in the WWC Procedures and Standards Handbook for more information on those calculations. If the first stage F statistic cannot be calculated, or the one that is reported does not demonstrate sufficient instrument strength, then the study finding will receive the research rating of does not meet WWC standards. For RCTs with cases that have demonstrated sufficient instrument strength, the next step in the review process is to assess whether there is a clear violation of the exclusion restriction. The exclusion restriction stipulates that the only channel through which assignment to conditions can influence outcomes is by affecting take-up of the intervention. For example, if assignment of a student to an intervention also causes parents to obtain other services unrelated to the intervention, then this is a violation of the exclusion restriction because assignment to condition might influence students' outcomes through a channel other than intervention participation. For a case estimate to have no clear violations of the exclusion restriction, a necessary condition is that the study must report a definition of take-up that is the same across assigned groups. The WWC's lead methodologist for a review has the discretion to determine that a study fails to satisfy the exclusion restriction as a result of a situation in which assignment to the intervention can influence the behavior of participants materially, even if they do not take up the intervention. For example, the exclusion restriction would be violated if participants assigned to the intervention group received offers to convince them to enroll in the comparison group instead. Other violations of the exclusion restriction may be similar to confounding factors. For example, if all classes in the intervention group meet in the morning and all classes in the comparison group meet in the afternoon. If there is a clear violation of the exclusion restriction, then the study finding will receive the research rating of does not meet WWC standards. For RCTs with cases that have demonstrated sufficient instrument strength and that have not violated the exclusion restriction, the next step in the review process is to assess whether the study is an RCT with low attrition. Attrition is calculated using the same WWC procedures and standards described in the group design training series. If the case estimate comes from a low attrition RCT and has sufficient instrument strength and no violations of the exclusion restriction, then the finding receives the research rating of meets WWC standards without reservations. If the case estimate comes from a high attrition RCT, then the finding is eligible to receive the research rating of meets WWC standards with reservations if it also satisfies the baseline equivalence standard. Again, the baseline equivalence standard is applied in its usual manner, as described in greater detail in the group design training series. We now will describe an extended knowledge check scenario to demonstrate the application of the CACE review criteria. When considering your answer to the following questions, you may want to pause the video and review the slides for relevant information. Researchers conducted an RCT to evaluate the effects of the good behavior game intervention on students' academic performance outcomes. The researchers assigned 100 students to the intervention group and 150 students to the comparison group. Follow-up data then were collected from 90 students in the intervention group and 130 students in the comparison group. The researchers noted that they reported the CACE rather than the ITT estimate because there was non-compliance. The researchers stated that take-up of the intervention was defined consistently for the intervention and comparison groups. The authors provided a detailed explanation for why the exclusion restriction was plausible in their study design, stating that the only channel through which assignment to conditions should have influenced outcomes is by affecting take-up of the intervention. The researchers used a two-stage least squares regression model to estimate the CACE impact. They reported that the first stage regression model predicted a binary indicator, T, for take-up of the intervention, using a binary indicator for group assignment, I, and no other covariates were included in the model. The first stage F statistic from this model was 17.23. The structural equation used to estimate the CACE also controlled for students' age, race, gender, and prior year grade point average. Attrition is assessed under the optimistic attrition boundary. Based on the scenario described on the previous slides, are the CACE findings from this study eligible for WWC review? Your response options are A, yes, B, no, because the authors used an endogenous and independent variable that was continuous, C, no, because the structural equation included multiple continuous endogenous independent variables, D, no, because a different set of covariates was used in the first stage equation and structural equation. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is D. The CACE findings from this study are not eligible for WWC review because a different set of covariates was used in the first stage equation and structural equation. Namely, the authors did not include any covariates in the first stage equation, but included age, race, gender, and prior year grade point average as covariates in the structural equation. In order to be eligible for a WWC review, a CACE estimate from an RCT must be derived from models where the set of baseline covariates are identical in the structural equation and first stage equation, otherwise the model is under-identified. In this example, the CACE estimate was estimated using an endogenous independent variable that was a binary indicator for taking up any portion of the intervention, and the structural equation included exactly one endogenous independent variable that was a binary indicator for participation. And the CACE was estimated using a two-stage least squares regression approach. Nonetheless, this finding would not be eligible for WWC review because the covariates used in the first stage and structural equations were not identical. Knowledge check 2. Considering the scenario described previously, let's now assume that the author did not use any covariates in the structural equation, so the CACE findings are eligible for review. Under this assumption, does the study's instrumental variable have sufficient instrument strength? Your response options are A, yes, or B, no. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Yes, the study's instrumental variable does have sufficient instrument strength. In this example, the authors estimated a first stage equation that included exactly one instrument and no additional covariates. The first stage F statistic value from this model was 17.23. The minimum required first stage F statistic from a model with one instrument is 16.38, So the F statistic in this example exceeds that minimum, meaning the findings have indeed satisfied the criterion of sufficient instrument strength. Knowledge check 3. Considering the scenario described previously, and again assuming that the authors did not include any covariates in the structural equation, what is the highest possible research rating of CACE findings from this study? Your response options are A, meets WWC standards without reservations, B, meets WWC standards with reservations, or C, does not meet WWC standards. You may want to pause the video while you think about your answer. The correct answer is A, meets WWC standards without reservations. The study's instrumental variable was established to have sufficient instrument strength. There was no clear violation of the exclusion restriction, and the study is an RCT with low attrition. So, the highest possible rating for CACE findings is meets WWC standards without reservations. This concludes our module on the WWC's standards and procedures for reviewing evidence from a unique type of advanced group design, randomized controlled trials that report complier average causal effects. You are now familiar with what types of CACE findings are eligible for WWC review and how the WWC determines research ratings for those CACE findings that are eligible for review. This now concludes the Advanced Group Design Training Series. If you wish to become certified in Advanced Group Designs, you must take the certification exam. You can access the Advanced Group Design Certification exam from the main training landing page. Remember that all of the resources mentioned in the Advanced Group Design Training Series can be accessed through the WWC website at whatworks.ed.gov.